Hi, so welcome everyone. Great to have you here for our Trendsetter Sotel session, and this is number 6. We did have Christine lined up last week, but unfortunately there was a bereavement in the family, so we've had to postpone that one. So Darren is number 6, and all the way from New Zealand. And because we are hosting these in Australia, we want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work here in Parkville, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Of course, our presenter today is based in New Zealand, so that's a different Indigenous environment. But looking forward to Darren sharing some of the work that he's been doing, strengthening the system, networked education. So I'm going to hand over to Darren. I'll stop screen sharing. And Darren, are you interested in getting questions as you're going, or would you like people to hold off on those until you've finished your presentation?
I'd love to have questions as I go along. I would much prefer a discussion than a straight presentation. So I'm more than happy for people to chime in, and I'll probably try and pause here and there to allow that to happen.
Sounds good. Usually there's quite a bit of comments that go on in the chat, so if you can keep an eye on that, or we'll relay any questions that come through on the chat. So
sure.
Thank you.
Darren, do you want me to just give a bit of a background on you, or do you want to do that yourself? Or?
Oh yes, I did ask Alistair to do the intro.
No, that's all right. That's all right. I just thought I don't mind. Certainly, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Darren to this forum, because we've had a little bit to do with each other, not a huge amount, but the amount that I've actually had to do with Darren has actually been really amazing, because the work that he is doing is actually really quite groundbreaking. He's executive leader for the NetNZ, where he has an oversight into the educational and business development area. But of course, he's had an extensive background in ICT, and so that's I think that's what's been of interest to us, in this particular forum, and especially what he's actually doing at the moment with regards to, what NetNZ has actually, has been actually doing throughout our country with networked learning, which he's had a lot to do in the past. He's a co-founding member of the Knowledge Building New Zealand, an association dedicated to the promotion of knowledge building and connected approaches to learning. And facilitates a lot of workshops around the place just to do with that. So, and of course, I think that might have been, where we've sort of connected once with my work that I was doing with Creative Forest. But anyway, Darren, it's great to have you present to us, and thank you. And I won't go on anymore, and I'll just leave it up to you now. So thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. I'll just share my screen, because I'll introduce myself. I'm going to do a pepeha, which is a sort of an instruction command. I just make sure I share the correct screen, because I've got multiple, so we can all see that. Okay. Okay. So kia ora tātou, ko opu ki te maunga, ko waimakariri te awa, no ototahi aho, ko Sudlow tōko whanau, ko Darren tōko ingoa. And I've got, as long as this works for me. There we go. Sorry. I've also got a karakia, so which is sort of a Māori blessing, but we start all our meetings, our hui, etc., over here with these, and they're written for a particular context, and this is ours. It is borrowed from elsewhere, but I think it's appropriate for, I suppose, the story I want to tell today and the key messages around there. So I'll just do this, and then I'll get into things. So. Ona hea te pō te pōwhiri mārama, tō makea te ao whātu tāngata. Tātai ki runga, tātai ki raru, tātai aho rau. Hāmu e, hui e, tai ki e. So from the confusion comes understanding. You may be confused, who knows, we'll find out. From the understanding comes unity. We're interwoven and we're interconnected together as one. And that is the key message from, I suppose, the work I've been doing and what I'll go through today. So, loosely called it Strengthening the System Network Education. term network learning can be used as well. However, there's a body of research around network learning, which is really independent of what I'm talking about today. So, by the way, there's a number of illustrations in here, which I've acknowledged that they're from one of our former students, Alicia Staniford. So she took my philosophy course, which I taught online, and she took our crafting history with me for 3 years, over the course of 3 years. She's NetNZ, and she was at Otahuhu College and Catlins Area School as well. And she's now Fine Arts postgrad at University of Canterbury, and she's been doing some of this work for us on the side in terms of illustrations, etc. So, yes, I'm going to tell you a wee story. So 2 sections here. One is, please feel free to throw questions my way. One is to give you some background, and the second is to then think about, okay, so what are the key messages out of that, because that's probably the key aspect. But I feel a bit of a imposter syndrome in terms of trendsetters and all the rest of it. I feel that really I'm a bit of a trend follower in this context, because this was going long before I came onto the scene. And it was something I feel hopefully that I've strengthened over years and managed to further develop. In terms of academic background, this is really a grassroots educational story. There'll be some academic context here and there. There was mention of knowledge building before, which I'll probably raise just quickly later on. But this is really about telling a story around what's possible in education, especially in response to adversity. So my context, where I came into this, was in 2008. So I now work for NetNZ. But in 2008, I was head of faculty, head of social sciences at Marlborough Girls College in the top of the South Island here in New Zealand. Head of social sciences and director of ICT e-learning. So we had a cluster we were part of, and had various initiatives, etc. I was from Christchurch, Canterbury, and had been away from Christchurch, Canterbury for a number of years. My first teaching position was in Auckland. It was very difficult to get a job in Christchurch when I was young, and my first job was at Auckland Grammar, which shocked the heck out of me. But yeah, I worked in Auckland Grammar initially, which is actually quite a useful grounding in terms of my CV. And then my pathway was really principalship. That's where I was intending to head with things. I'd always been fired up with education. I wanted to influence change, that I wanted to make a difference. However, we wanted to get back to Christchurch, Canterbury. In 2008, 4 years I'd been at Marlborough Girls, a job advert came up in Canterbury, advertised in this e-learning leader for Cantertech. Now, I'd never heard of Cantertech. I had no idea what this was all about. E-learning leader sounded good to me because I had a strong background in ICT. I developed some websites, etc., for our department. I'd been taking on learning online for quite some time, and we got to go back to Canterbury. I was intrigued. And I went along to I got an interview, etc. I got off the job on that day and found out a bit more about it. I had no idea what I was getting into. I had a 2-year contract. I'll explain briefly in a second, but I'm still in there 16 years later. And my pathway in education is totally diverged. I've gone a completely different direction than I ever anticipated, which is what was wonderful about life, I suppose. So that was a job advert, and I got this job. Luckily enough. And where it came from, in terms of telling the story here, is back in 1994. So thinking 14 years or so before I got appointed, in Canterbury, there's a number of area schools. Now, in New Zealand, area schools go from year 1 to 13. So they cover primary, secondary. They cover everything. They're based in rural New Zealand. Some of these communities and schools are very isolated, as you would have in Australia as well, I know. And they would vary in size. So Oxford Area School at this time was probably 300 to 400 or so. It's 500 to 600 now. There are area schools we cater to. Currently, are very small, like our Karamea Area School, which in the west coast here would be 83 students tops. So these schools traditionally have challenges in terms of meeting curriculum, in particular senior curriculum. So in 1994, Carol Moffat, I don't know if Alistair knows Carol, meet Carol before, but Carol Moffat was a key person in this whole development. And she's still around now, thank goodness. She's left education. Typical Carol, she's an artist. She does her own art and sells it, etc. So she's gone on to another world entirely. But she's had a huge influence in ICT in New Zealand over time. But in this situation, she was principal at Oxford Area School, and they had issues, like many area schools, in terms of providing curriculum. So their role was declining. Parents were leaving, parents sending their kids off to private schools in Christchurch. At the time, the correspondence school was a distance education provider for schools in New Zealand, and there was a correspondence school model. So I'm not having a go at that model here, but for these schools, they wanted something different. They wanted kids to be connected with a teacher and quite directly with a teacher and to be more supported. So what Carol did is came up with an idea and said, well, talk to the other area schools. There's 7 back in 1993. This first came, actually, the project was formed. What if we start sharing teachers? So what if Oxford Area School, we run one of our small classes. Say we've got 3 to 4 students who are going to take level 3 physics. What if we put that class out there for the other area schools to enroll their senior students in? And then what if one of the other schools, let's say it's a Murray Area School, puts up history, senior history, and they may have some students in it locally, they may not, but that allows students from the other schools to put their to enroll in these courses. So back in the first year was 7 courses: history, Japanese, a few things. They had about 78 or so total students. But that was the first year they got the model off the ground. They got some support from various technology companies in Christchurch in New Zealand. It was based, I'll go into the details in a second, but this was a fairly groundbreaking grassroots ideas like, okay, let's share teachers, let's do this together, work together so we can maintain our curriculum, we can maintain our senior students, and to some extent maintain our community. So just to be clear, the Canterbury Area Schools, this is where they are located. So it goes right down to Twizel Area School, Twizel, which is on the doorstep to Central Otago, really. So you can see right down the bottom there. Twizel is really quite isolated. It's a beautiful place. It's stunning. I remember my first drive there. And so that's right down the bottom, and most are sort of central North Canterbury area. So you can see Hiranui College, Oxford Area School, Cheviot Area School, very small. They're all located in a similar region. And this is essentially the concept. So the idea is each school would put up a course. Sometimes you could put up 2 courses. And by putting up a course, it gave you the right to put your students into the other courses. So you would have, say, from a Murray Area School, 2 teachers delivering 2 different courses. And they would have students from across the other schools in their courses delivered at a distance. So they used audio conferencing back in these days. So it was audio conferencing and a lot of paper. Because of the location, they could bring students together face to face at times. It wasn't too difficult for a teacher to travel, but they couldn't do that too much. There's essentially a distance education, but distance education provided by the schools to each other, which is probably the key aspect to this whole thing. So they got that going. That developed for a few years. If I go back, basically in 1998, the 7 area schools, 4 more schools came on board. So that would have included Darfield Area School, outside Darfield High School. So went beyond area schools. So it was called Katatech in the early days. And when they brought on other schools, it became Cantatech. And that was, Cantatech was the very first, what became known as e-learning cluster in New Zealand in the late 90s. And that carried on for a few years. And then that model started being adopted in other rural areas of New Zealand. So a key cluster, a key community was what became OtagoNet. So the central Otago area schools and high schools as well formed their own community, their own cluster called OtagoNet. And around the same time, in the far north of New Zealand, Whānui was formed. So the Northland schools, area schools again, some very small schools, large Māori populations as well, they formed a cluster as well. But OtagoNet is pretty key. So you've got a photo there of Ken Puller, who's still my colleague now in NetNZ. So in 2001, OtagoNet was formed, and Ken is really, I see him as, I call him the grandfather of all this, really. Carol Moffat was integral in terms of getting it up and going. and Ken, really with the CargoNet, developed a model that could be copied. It sort of set some parameters, some coherence in terms of approach, and it was copied around various places. So what happened is this model was developed all across New Zealand, and these different clusters were formed, sometimes quite organically. So, and there would usually be 10 to 11 schools, sometimes it might be 6 schools. So they ranged in size, but they covered virtually all of rural New Zealand. There wouldn't be too many area schools who would not be a part of one of these clusters, but it also wasn't just area schools. It was high schools as well, who were sometimes rurally based, and gradually it seeped into urban areas as well. 2008 was when I came into it. So that's where I am in the middle there. What happened in 2008 is the Ministry of Education decided to support this. So up until this point, it was largely grassroots. And then 2008, they came up with what's called the ePrincipal project. So in the photo there, the far right is a person called Chris Alec McPhee. She was one of the teachers in Oxford Area School to begin with. She was seconded, she went into the ministry with Eddie Reich, and they sort of got this whole idea going, and it was funded by the ministry. And what they did is they funded these leadership positions around the country for each cluster. So up until this point, the schools were just doing it organically. So they would have leadership, but they wouldn't get a lot of time. Ken Puller, who I mentioned before, was DP of Roxburgh Area School. So he was sort of doing it as an addition to what he was doing in the school already. For the first time with the Ministry of Education funding, 2/3 of the leadership was funded by the Ministry of Education. What it also did is it brought the leadership together at a national level. And so you had this, what became known as a virtual learning network. So all these clusters operating regionally were able to connect together, and each cluster, we shared courses. So if Cantertech had 11 courses, that's not the whole curriculum, we would be able to enroll our students in courses from Baylink, from FarNet. We basically worked together to make sure that any student in rural New Zealand could do a course, whatever course they wanted. And it was this whole reciprocal environment. So not just the schools putting in, but together we strengthened this whole system, and we had this national backbone of virtual learning that was happening in New Zealand. It was largely video conference based by this point. So 2001, it shifted from audio conferencing. And around that time as well, of course, you got development of asynchronous technology, which allowed all sorts of environments to be developed. So Moodle would be an example. I think even Microsoft Classes, something going way back. There's various things that developed over the years. Various learning management systems were used, as well as the video conference technology. But this was an integral time. And for me, this was like a 2 or 3 years that I remember really fondly, because together we worked really hard to try and push things forward and to give a voice to what we're doing, because it was largely hidden. As I said, I had no idea this was going on until I actually got appointed to the job. Now, I was largely urban, and big urban schools. I hadn't really come across rural schools too much at all. I had preconceived ideas of what it will look like. So the virtual learning network was integral in terms of getting this, or developing this at a national level, and really building some capacity. However, as happens, we had a change of government. So this was around 2010, somewhere around there. So with the change of government, a change in priorities, and the funding was gone. So all the funding that would for these positions disappeared, and suddenly all these schools and these clusters were faced with a decision to make over the future of what they were doing, and the future of the people who've been contracted, like myself, to lead the various clusters. And of course, what the vast majority of those clusters decided to do was to continue to do it, but they would do it themselves, and the schools would fund it themselves. So essentially all the schools said, yep, together we'll continue this, we'll bear the burden in terms of the operations of the cluster, and we'll include that cost in the resourcing we're putting in. Thinking about the fact that schools are putting in courses, so they're sort of putting in a portion of their staffing, but they're always getting back. I'll explain that later on. But they're also now going to have to cover the operations and salaries of the cluster itself. So there was quite a substantial cost, especially for small area schools, but they decided to do that, and they really had little choice in doing that. So you had a question of sustainability over this whole thing after that point. So what happened with Cantatech is we merged, just keep an eye on the time, we merged with Arakinet, who were the clusters around the Araka region in New Zealand, South Island. So it's South Canterbury, Timaru area, Waimate, etc. There are about 10, 11 schools like Cantatech was. We merged and formed Cantanet. And Trevor Storr and myself, Trevor was the lead at Arakinet. We drew it together. Trevor went part-time and I was full-time. He very nicely, kindly stepped aside to go part-time, and I took over a full-time position, 22 schools, and we formed Cantanet share just to make sure we could sustain it. That we actually, for the cost of the schools, we could actually make it manageable for them. It would increase the scale and workload for us to some extent, but we were prepared to do that, and that was a way forward. And that was probably really the first step towards further sustainability. We'd had ongoing conversations about the future of the Virtual Learning Network as a national group, and we're still meeting as a national group at this time. Virtual Learning Network still existed, and we talked about regionalising as a way forward, and various other sort of ways forward, as well. So what happened is in 2013, Ken Puller, on the left there, who's the leader of TargoNet, I mentioned before, came. He met with myself and Trevor. We knew each other well anyway, we working together at a national level, with the concept of pulling Cantanet and TargoNet together as a new organisation called NetNZ. So all the clusters were informal organisations. So there was no formal legal body representing those clusters. They were just loose collections of schools who were putting money together. I was employed by a school. So I was at Darfield High School, although I wasn't really working at Darfield High School. That was just my base school, and it still works that way to some extent. The three of us put NetNZ together. So we came up with the idea of, okay, we'll form a limited liability company owned by a charitable trust. The charitable trust would own all the shares of the company. We would make it an endeavour that would not only have a sort of a legal framework, but would allow us to, I suppose, run commercially. So we would go out to other schools and advertise our courses at a cost that any school could enrol their students in our courses. So, and we took quite a bit of the responsibility for the network away from all the principals who were working together to make it happen. And they all agreed to it. At that point, they were quite happy to get it off their plate, and they trusted us to take the next step with this. And what happened is that pulled in all the other e-learning clusters in the South Island. So WestNet, Dunedin Net, Silk, they all looked at it and went, okay, we'll join this. Happened over the period of a year until the whole of the South Island had become one organisation. And it was that point where things started to get really interesting in terms of how you run that sort of organisation. It brought with it coherence across these different sort of communities. It took a few years to bed in because you had sort of differences across the different clusters. So we had to try and bring some coherence to it, but it also brought challenge because the bigger the scale, the sort of less nimble you are, less responsive you are to things. And we weren't able to scale up our resourcing anymore. It was pretty much the same resourcing. We're just pulling things together to make it more sustainable, to make it more coherent, and to assure that this would continue forward. And NetNZ still exists now, 10 years later. So it has worked in terms of doing that. This has not disappeared. I wouldn't say it's grown exponentially, but it's still sustainable and it will continue. No matter what happens with government, whatever happens with ministry, the schools are still part of a community. There's a slightly different dynamic, but they still understand that in it together in terms of, if we don't do this, we run quite major risks. And there are various reasons schools get involved. You can see all those schools that are involved there on the map. They're not all area schools, they're high schools, and some of these high schools are urban. So we drew in some Christchurch schools. Marion College will be one now. You can see we got into the North Island to some extent as well. But what happened to the North Island e-learning clusters, you may be wondering. So they gradually merged together as well. So what we have now, got a long story short, are two major networks one largely North Island based, but not entirely, and one largely South Island based, but not entirely. And both these networks run in partnership. So all the learning clusters in the North Island formed, they initially formed what was called the Online Learning Community, and just over a recent year or two, formed what's called Katoa Yako. So the same concept, but they just scaled things up. It made it more sustainable, meant schools were able to participate still, and it was ensured it would continue. We still reciprocate. So we still share courses. So 23 of the courses our students access in NetNZ are from Katoa Yako, and they would probably have a few more from us. And that whole national backbone is still really important. We wouldn't say there's a virtual learning network anymore. There's two organisations who work in partnership. And there's room for others, to be perfectly honest, but I'll get into that in terms of how it works, etc. I'll just pause there because that's essentially the history of everything. And I've skimmed over quite a lot just in the interest of time. Has anyone got any questions or discussion points, anything they're wondering about that they need me to elaborate on at all in terms of what I've just talked about? So what I'm going to do now is just explain how it actually works at a teaching and learning level and organisationally.
Are you aware, Darren, of anything similar, based in Australia or across Australia?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was going to highlight that later on. So I wouldn't have full knowledge of everything that happens educationally around the world. I am fairly familiar with various regions. In Australia, I don't, of course, there's various virtual high schools I'm aware of. When was it? In the early stages of NetNZ, the West Australian Catholic Schools Network came over to us, established a contact. Their principal and a potential lead person came over to New Zealand and met with us and visited a number of our schools and examined the model and took it over to Australia and put it in place over in Western Australia. And as far as I know, that still exists today. So I don't have much contact with them anymore, but basically they took our model and put it in place for West Australian schools, Catholic schools. And I think they were largely supported by Microsoft as well, whereas we've had little support on that front. So yeah, and there's also internationally, in the States, there's the VHS Learning, which was once known as the VHS Collaborative. I don't know if anyone's aware of them. They're based in Massachusetts. I made contact with them recently because I was intrigued. I knew of them for a long time. Same model. Essentially, their schools provide the courses. They fill in some gaps, but the schools become part of this organisation. There's this partnership that's formed. They're much bigger, understandably in the States, much bigger. They've got other challenges with virtual high schools over there in quite a competitive environment. But they're the only two I know of, Tom.
I see that there's a question from Ben.
Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. Darren, really interesting. I used to help look after the university's video conferencing setup from 2007. And I've noticed, obviously, like back then, it was very difficult with video conferencing equipment, the Polycoms and what have you. And then when Skype and Zoom came in, it was much easier. So I'm interested to know from a technical point of view, how has the developments over that period changed the communication? Has it improved things, or has there been any difficulties that way, or has it been all improvement? And do any of the old video conference systems still get used, or have they all been thrown in the bin?
That's a great question. That segues really nicely into the slide, actually. But the technology has helped no end. When I first came into it, the internet connection across rural New Zealand was really a challenge. And we were using largely the Google Suite and the video conferencing. There's Polycom cameras, as you mentioned. So there was ASNet, a company who hosted that in Wellington. So that was all supported by the ministry. So when I say the Ministry of Education stopped funding the leadership, they still funded some of the technology and the video conferencing bridge. So it was all done through the TVs. Every school had a dedicated room where they had the video conference gear. The students would go in, it will be booked out, etc. And then at a certain point, of course, desktop video conferencing came to be. And increasingly the question came from our schools and from us is, should we be using this? Should we be using this? And there was a certain point we said, and the schools were faced with old gear, and they were coming to us saying, should we buy new gear? Now, looking at $15,000 in New Zealand, and that's for a rural school, that's a lot of money. And we were going, no, you shouldn't. You should not do it. Give it 2 or 3 years, and I think we'll shift it to desktop video conferencing. Unfortunately, 1 or 2 still did. I know of at least one school that still has that gear around. Most of them would have binned them. If they were really onto it, they would have sold them early on. So some did that. But essentially, all the video conferencing shifted to desktop video conferencing. So we use various platforms, but currently, we've used Zoom particularly in recent years, but in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been Google Meet. So we're using the Google Suite largely. But what it's meant is access is so much easier. Students can get into the video conference sessions wherever they are, and same with teachers. And they can just get on a laptop, get on a phone if it's not banned. They can do it from wherever. I remember doing my video conference sessions from by the banks of the River Avon in Christchurch, a beautiful setting. I'm going, this is what life should be like. I'll get onto that a bit later on in terms of flexibility, but that technology has really helped a lot. We've got fibre in New Zealand now throughout our schools. Technology in terms of the speed of connection is not a problem anymore. It's not a challenge. Sometimes infrastructure can be in schools, increasingly filtering and blocking and control of these sort of systems within schools are creating more and more problems for us in a networked environment. The asynchronous technology, the development there has been fantastic for us. Like the platforms that are available now, I mean, there's a plethora of them, and we've gone for a particular flavor. I mean, the slide I've got here is explaining how it'll work. So just in terms of the teaching and learning side of things, the model hasn't changed significantly over the years. There's good and bad with that, but essentially you've got a group of 10 to 20 students. So usually a maximum of 20 students in a course. With one teacher, we do have some collaborative courses with 2 teachers working with 40 students, but then we split the video conferencing, so it's not overwhelming. There's a once a week video conference, and that is set. So it's timetabled in. It's the one inflexibility in the environment. So there's lots of ways of approaching online learning internationally, and one is to do it entirely asynchronously. There's new, like Crimson Global Academy has emerged in New Zealand recently as a private provider. They do a lot of synchronous. So there's a lot of classes. Ours is a mix. It's largely asynchronous with a set once a week set video conference, and our teachers and students will use video conferencing flexibly outside of that to catch up one-to-one. The key is it's the idea with environments, a highly connected environment and a highly supported environment. So one way of approaching online learning is a self-paced environment where you work through content and may be quite interactive, but you're largely working through content with some connection here and there with a teacher and people. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's one model. This model is really placing people at the center of things, and it's looking at the importance of a teacher and a group of students together as of primary importance still, even in this age. And what we find is the video conference, we've had challenges here and there, so should we toss this out entirely, make it entirely flexible? But what it does is it creates a cycle of accountability because the students and the teacher are coming back to each other face to face almost every week, and they're looking at the work for the week and they're discussing various things. It creates this cycle that everyone gets used to this routine, and it creates this connection. So there's a lot of research in online learning and the benefits and the negatives, etc. One thing that's recognized that you do lose in online learning is a sense of immediacy. So no matter where you are, even in video conferencing, you don't quite get the immediacy you get face to face. So it's actually what can you do online that can do that as much as possible. To what extent can we make that happen? I heard that someone was talking about virtual reality before. That's going to be a really interesting area to examine going into the future. But the closest we can get currently is through the video conferencing, and that creates that real sense of connection, and that continues through the asynchronous technology. So we use we will use Google Plus communities. So I don't know if anyone here remembers Google Plus. It was Google's answer to Facebook, a social network, but a lot of professionals used it. We've deliberately steered clear of learning management systems, and it's not a critique or criticism of those who are using them. They're used extensively, especially by universities, because we're managing huge numbers of students. We're not. We're managing around 700 to 800 students. And it's a distributed environment. We bring it together largely through the Google Suite. But Google discontinued Google Plus. And so we've been exploring Google Spaces recently, which is Google's answer to Teams and Slack, Teams of Microsoft and Slack. So in the business world, what you're seeing is, in technology in particular, you're seeing the emergence of environments that are highly connected and team-based and allow connection. So we've actually been exploring those sorts of environments and how can we bring learning design and the structure and content that's necessary for online learning into one of those sorts of environments where community and connection and people are more prominent. So that's required a lot of thinking, but that's the ethos that we've brought to this is this idea of being very people-centered. On the left-hand side, we've still got this idea of our courses are provided by the schools. Almost all our courses are provided by our schools. Sometimes we have to fill in the gaps with funding, and we have to fund the course ourselves because we can't find a teacher in one of the schools, but that teacher will still be based in a school. And I'll talk about the benefits of that later on. So you've still got this network, you've still got Twizel Area School offering level 3 calculus. In fact, their principal is teaching that this year. And that has students from Ellesmere College, for example, in Canterbury. It has students up in North Island as well. So that same premises there. Each school has what's called an EDing. So it's a site supervisor. So again, online learning, especially in secondary primary schools, you need someone on site to support students. Adults often don't have the self-management skills to manage themselves, so let alone teenagers. And so they need someone on site who acts as a support person, as a go-between, someone that the teacher who's at a distance can work with to ensure they maintain the engagement of students, because face-to-face, it can be a challenge in engaging teenagers. So as you can imagine, from the distance, that challenge is probably amplified. Well, it is amplified. We certainly get very able students in the environment. Our schools vet to some extent. However, area schools don't have a lot of choice. If they want to cater for their community, they can't discriminate too much on who gets into the environment. It's actually about how much support you can give those students in the environment. And that's the key aspect of it. So that answer to your question is sort of where we are environments-wise. Google Spaces has been interesting. It has its negatives, its challenges, but we're finding our way with it. We're also using Mattermost, which is very similar to Discord and Slack, but it's an environment we can host ourselves. We manage it ourselves. It's just a bit of a more complex environment. So some teachers, we've only probably got about 10 teachers using it, including myself. Sorry, were there any other questions about stuff I mentioned before? In terms of the stuff I mentioned, the background, the history? This is really elaborating on what I was just talking about before. So let's move to desktop video conferencing. We use all sorts of platforms to highlight connection. There's an element of knowledge building that's been embraced by a few teachers over the years. This is something I've been immersed in since 2013. So in the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner, is what's happening this year with my senior philosophy group. And I suppose it's just highlighting, and they've also got an environment here we can see in terms of discussions, etc. It's a highly connected environment. It's largely text-based, and then with the video on top of that. So it'd be really interesting to, 10 years time to see what virtual reality or the whole metaverse idea has done with education, if anything. But it's probably the best we can do currently in terms of connections. But I suppose what sort of learning? It's people-based learning. We wrote, when I say we, the Virtual Learning Network, a few years ago wrote a whole publication that outlines the history of the Virtual Learning Network and the pedagogy behind it. So it's firmly rooted in research in terms of what works in online learning and what works for us. There's diversity, but there is an approach at work. And so this unpacks and details that. If anyone's interested, I'm more than happy in sharing that. So it should be publicly available. But that was really important for us. It's the first time we'd actually pulled the model together in terms of the teaching and learning. So in terms of how it works as well, just as reinforcing of it's a reciprocal environment. So not even thinking about the teaching and learning, the schools that commit to this are committing to a way of thinking. They're committing to, we will put in courses or our course or staffing representing a course into the mix for all the other schools and the other students to engage with. And by doing so, we can then take out of the environment and we can enroll students. That is still the basis for what we do. And I've been involved for 16 years. The teaching and learning, some of that is going on is really quite innovative. There's some good stuff, but there's a lot of just really good competent stuff as well that you wouldn't raise eyebrows at all. But this whole concept of a reciprocal environment where schools are doing it for each other and they're actually providing for each other rather than relying on some other sort of virtual high school, to me is highly innovative. And I haven't, you asked before, Tom, have I seen it too many other places? I haven't seen it too many